It's easy to be an expert in archery, at least the armchair kind. In our pursuit of knowledge, we sometimes come across information which may or may not be true. Archery is one of those things where it's easy to draw conclusions from watching it or reading about it, but often what you see and read differs to what is actually being done, and because of that it breeds a range of misconceptions or assumptions about archery. This video will go through 10 common assumptions about archery which may have some truth to them, but for the most part may be misleading. The first assumption is that archery requires arm strength. This makes some obvious sense because you use your arms to pull the bow. In actuality, you use your back muscles more than your arm muscles. While having strong arm muscles does help, the reality is that you are holding the majority of the load on your back muscles, which is a far stronger way to carry loads. It's why you see people say, put your back into it, or even things like activating your core muscles. Your strong muscles are here, not here. This is for display, not for strength. So someone who has huge biceps isn't necessarily going to be able to draw a heavy bow. Whereas people who do archery over a long period of time will find that they have toned shoulders and a very toned back. The next assumption is that archery requires dexterity. Now, this often is seen in games where the archer character needs to specialize in dexterity or agility. The actual action of shooting a bow requires strength. If you don't have enough strength, you can't physically pull the bow back, and that means you can't use the bow. Now, there are certain things which would require dexterity, and the main thing to think about when it comes to archery is the ability to load and nock arrows really quickly. So someone who is dexterous should be able to do this with much more speed than I can. But the actual shooting is something that is mostly based on your physical conditioning. And no, being more dexterous doesn't mean you can suddenly aim better. The next assumption is that you have to be young to do archery. I often get questions from people in their senior years, 50s or 60s, who want to start doing archery, but they get concerned about being too old to do it. Archery can be done by anyone. You will see many people shoot into their 60s and 70s and older. Now, of course, you might think that, well, they started really young, so they keep on doing it till they're older. But again, archery does not discriminate. You don't have to be a physically fit person to do archery. The easy way to get into archery for someone who is older is to shoot a lighter bow. And that's fine. I mean, you don't have to shoot a heavy competitive draw weight or go hunting with a 70-pound bow to enjoy archery. People who are older can definitely get into the sport even though they haven't done it for 30 or 40 years. If you're wondering why you see so many young people doing archery as a sport, well, firstly, they're younger. They have more time, and for those who compete, they have the ability to train more regularly. It doesn't mean that someone who is 30 or starting at 40 can't shoot decently at a competitive level. If you have the time, the commitment, then you will succeed. If you don't have the time, and that's the case for many older people, then you won't have the same level of achievement as someone who's training 5 days a week or 6 days a week. So that's really the only distinguishing factor. Otherwise, archery is very age friendly. On that note, the next assumption is that archery is easy. Wow, this is going to be a very divisive thing because I get this a lot from commentators that archery is easy, and if you need to use sights to hit the target, then you're obviously an unskilled loser. Well, where do we start with that? Well, to be fair, I think many people have this shared experience of archery, where we've done archery at school or on camp, and we have some idea of what archery is. And at camp, you probably hit the target, and therefore you can judge how easy archery is. I guess the reality here is that the activities that you do in these settings are set up so that you're not meant to fail this. It's meant to give you a very easy success criteria. But that success criteria doesn't apply anywhere else. For real archery, I'm talking about sport archery or hunting, you have much different success criteria. For a hunter, you need to be able to hit the vital zone of a deer at 30 meters or so. For a competitive target shooter, they have to hit a DVD-sized bullseye at 70 meters. So that becomes a lot less easy and a lot more challenging. And regardless of whether you shoot bare bow or you use sights, it's still very difficult to hit that target. Archery is very much a sport where it is easy to learn but difficult to master. The next assumption is that modern bows are machines. And again, I get this a lot from people who criticize modern archery because they use sights and stabilizers and other gadgets. But I think this is misleading for several reasons. The first is that we don't really define modern archery that clearly. Modern archery isn't just the Olympic style sport bows that you see. Modern archery also encompasses other kinds of bows. And a bow like this is very much a modern bow. It's an aluminium recurve bow. That's takedown. This pretty much epitomizes what people today will use. And this is definitely not a machine. And I've said in other videos that fundamentally this and this really aren't that different. And given that people think that having a bare bow is a sign of skill and what real archery is, does the fact that I add a sight make this a machine? Real bow, machine. Real bow, machine. And there are bows today which are definitely mechanical. The compound bows are the epitome of mechanical bow technology, but they still require user input. And by that I mean the person actually has to shoot the bow, and they still have to do it right. Otherwise, all that mechanical advantage is thrown out the window. In the end, modern bows are not self-shooting machines. You still need to use the bow well, whether you see it as a practical tool, which is a precision device, or whether it's something a bit more bare bones. In the end, it is still the user, not the bow. On a similar note, the next assumption is that archery is linear. And what I mean by this is that many people will put every bow, every archery style, and just shooting in general on one linear progression. So you have traditional bows and modern recurve bows and compound bows and crossbows and so on. And you often see this in the commentary where people will say, oh, if you're going to use an Olympic recurve, you might as well use a compound. And if you're going to use a compound, you might as well use a gun, and so on. This makes sense to me in some way, because if you see this from the perspective of just hitting the target, then you either go completely bare bones or you go with the complete mechanical precision shooting machine. This, to me, is a very narrow view of archery on shooting in general. Instead of seeing it as a linear progression, see it as multiple branches. So you have all different kinds of shooting devices. You have rifles and pistols and compound bows and recurve bows and traditional bows, and all these things suit different people with different purposes. You don't tell someone who shoots a pistol, oh, why don't you just use a rifle? Because they're different things. And the same goes with archery. I don't use a gun, one, because I can't get one, and secondly, a gun isn't a bow. But I don't want to shoot a compound because I like the physicality of a recurve. And thankfully in the modern times, we have the luxury of picking what kind of bow or what kind of shooting we want to do. It's not about progressing or regressing. It's a choice people make, and all styles are equally valid. The next assumption is a bit more technical. You can use any arrow from any bow. I'll say this is very much a video game inspired thing where you have a generic like arrow ammunition type. So the arrow might be in the ground, you walk over it, you pick it up, and then you can use it out of any bow. You can actually use most arrows from most bows as long as it's not too short. The catch with using these arrows from a different bow is that you have a thing called spine, which is the amount of flex the arrow has. For every bow you use, you have a particular draw weight at your length, and if the arrow does not correctly flex around the bow, then you have clearance issues. The arrow will not leave the bow cleanly, which means it will not be as accurate. With modern bows, people have much greater expectations on accuracy and precision. So people will go to greater lengths to find a better matching spine. That means if your spine is slightly off, then the accuracy is not good enough. You can still shoot an off-spine arrow, but it won't be as good as what you might want it to be. For traditional bows and arrows, you couldn't really manufacture the same range of spines as we have today. You basically have your bamboo arrow or your wooden arrow cut to a certain thickness, and that was basically it. So while you can shoot most arrows from most bows, it doesn't mean you shoot them well. The next assumption is a historical one, and that is arrows were good against armour or specific kinds of armour. Now we know that plate armour was generally impervious to arrows and well basically everything, but a lot of people are fixated on mail, how mail is made from rings and therefore arrows can penetrate these rings. That's not how mail works. The other reason why this is misleading is because a lot of the demonstrations, either from amateurs or from TV shows, will use a variety of mail called butted mail, and that's just basically rings which are closed but not sealed, which means they come apart much more easily with less force. So often you see something like Deadliest Warrior, where they'll shoot arrows at point blank range at a pig wearing chainmail. That's really not accurate because the mail is not the same kind used historically. Historically, a lot of mail was made using riveted mail. That's basically where the ring is sealed by a rivet, which makes it much stronger. So it's much harder to break apart using blunt weapons or sharp weapons and even arrows. And those who think that you can just shoot the arrow through the rings aren't that big, and there's multiple dense layers, and some varieties of mail were very dense, much like a piece of lamellar armor. So it was actually very hard to penetrate mail. In addition, mail was normally worn over another layer, and typically it was gambeson, where you have multiple layers of padded cloth, really densely packed. And often against light bows, this cloth armor that was very heavily packed, the gambeson alone could absorb arrows. So someone who's wearing gambeson and mail on top of that is actually quite strong against arrows. Even if you could penetrate the mail, it doesn't mean you'll penetrate the gambeson. The reason why arrows were so effective in the ancient times was because most people didn't have armor. Later on, when people did wear mail armor or lamellar armor or plate armor, then it was much harder to kill someone with an arrow. But again, only people who had armor were protected, and not every body part was covered in armor. Leading on from that, the next assumption is that arrows are deadly. And this is very much a video game or a movie trope. Games like Far Cry, for example, arrows are the one-hit kill weapon. So someone gets hit with an arrow, thunk, and they'll die. So what's the reality here? While you can definitely wound someone with an arrow, killing them outright can be a lot more difficult. The human body surprisingly, is well designed to not die. You have a lot of things which protect you. You have, of course, your skeleton, your ribcage, your skull. So your vital organs are relatively well protected. And even if you do hit a part of the body which isn't protected, then it's not going to do a whole lot. Now, if you get hit in, say, the heart, for example, or the brain, and the arrow penetrates, then sure, instant kill. If you hit someone with a broad head and you slice their arteries, sure, they'll bleed out, especially in the center of mass where there's lots of vital organs. But if you're shooting someone with, say, an armor-piercing kind of arrowhead, which is mostly narrow, then it won't necessarily kill them. Often they'll just be wounded. They will die, but that's because of infection, not because of the arrow itself killing them. Remember, back then, the idea of bacteria and germs and hygiene weren't that well known. And the fact that you're fighting in a war where people are covered in dirt and mud and you're sticking arrows in the ground and pulling them out. Yeah, if you get hit by an arrow, there are bigger threats to you than the arrow itself. The final assumption, which I've touched on briefly earlier, is that there is one kind of archery, real archery. And you see this a lot in commentaries on YouTube where people subscribe to one form of archery above all others. And this, I think, is the biggest assumption and the biggest misconception. I think this assumption or misconception is the biggest source of disagreement and conflict between different people doing archery, where one person thinks that their style is the correct way and other styles are incorrect. Archery is diverse. It has been around since the dawn of humanity, and to say that it's only been used for one purpose or should be used for one purpose is completely wrong. Archery has been used for hunting, for war, for survival, and for sport. And no matter what kind of archery you do, every form of archery is valid. So those are 10 common assumptions I've seen made about archery. Of course, I've probably left a few out, so if you have more to add, feel free to post below. Hopefully this adds a bit more insight to archery and its many forms, and when you see someone make these assumptions, maybe you can have a bit more enlightenment and inform them as well. This is NUSensei, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.